Now, here we just saw Lincoln come off of recognizing the straw man argument being used against him as far as race baiting is concerned. But now we see Lincoln really crank up the intensity with his thesis saying that I'm keeping slavery penned up, and on top of that, it's a moral wrong. And he blends together the hierostatical art a little bit with this next thesis statement here by saying that even though the Democrats, even if they recognize it as a wrong, and certainly Lincoln recognizes it as a wrong, they want to expand slavery into the territories. And Lincoln's saying if something is wrong, it must not be expanded. And he really defines those as Republican Party principles. And in a very famous line, he's saying that slavery being a moral issue is the real crux of this debate, and that this issue is going to kind of define America and define political life. And he's saying this debate is going to go on in a very poetic way. This debate will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. And to further illustrate that design or that idea, Lincoln says slavery operates on the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself. It is in the same spirit that says you work and toil and earn bread, and I'll eat it. So sort of pointing out that slavery is a moral wrong because it's depending on the work of others and they're not reimbursed for it. That they create bread, they create, they're an extremely potent labor force, yet they are never reimbursed for their efforts. And that is a significant evolution in Lincoln's thought because he later comes back to this bread analogy in his second inaugural address. And here we are at the end of the House Divided adaptation of this speech, saying that, once we're able to put slavery, recognize it as a wrong and keep it from expanding, that we will soon be putting slavery on its path toward its ultimate extinction. James Oakes wrote extensively on this topic in the book The Scorpion Sting, because Lincoln realizes that by keeping slavery penned up, it will eventually be destroyed. But I would really like to draw our attention to Lincoln's real conclusion that came at the conclusion of his full response, which you can find on the National Parks website. And here we see Lincoln using the hierostatical art to really embarrass Judge Douglas because of his belief in popular sovereignty. And the most potent line in this conclusion is, I defy any man to make an argument that will justify unfriendly legislation to deprive a slaveholder of his right to hold his slave in a territory that will not equally, in all of its length, breadth, and thickness, furnish an argument for nullifying the fugitive slave law. So here, this is the truest example of the hierostatical art because Lincoln is actually calling on audience members, and implicitly Stephen Douglas, to develop unfriendly legislation to deprive slave owners of their right to take a slave into a new territory. Now, it's important for background's sake that we understand when Lincoln uses the term unfriendly legislation, that term comes from Stephen Douglas. He said that even if a territory voted to be a free territory or a free state, if a slave owner came into that territory, they could sort of put social and political pressure on this slave owner with somehow not depriving them of their rights to own slaves, this unfriendly legislation that would encourage a slave owner to leave. So Lincoln is sort of taking this contradiction and really blowing it up and really showing it to the audience, really highlighting it to get them to see to really show those shortcomings of unfriendly legislation as a part of popular sovereignty. So first and foremost, if an audience member or Stephen Douglas is saying that you can pass this type of legislation, this unfriendly legislation, it's illegal. Thanks to the Fugitive Slave Law, which is a constitutional provision saying that once slaves escape, they must be brought back to their owners. It's also flying in the face of the Dred Scott decision, because once technically slaves, they are not people. They are property. And if one is brought into this, this territory, there is no type of legislation that can supersede a federal, a Supreme Court decision saying that, hey, a slave owner has the right to bring their property into the territory. So really it puts Douglas in this awkward position because it's empowering citizens to become abolitionists through legislation, which was, still somewhat of a radical position, or a not quite politically accepted route just yet. And it's also striking Douglas in a very awkward way because he's expected to kind of toe the line for the slave interests of the slave owners, of protecting the institution of slavery as a Democratic Party official. So here he's stuck because no matter how he answers, he's either saying, yes, you can outlaw slavery, which is something that slave owners do not want to hear, or at least if you can't outlaw it, you can make areas unfriendly to slavery's spread. Now keep in mind, too, that this type of unfriendly legislation is going to be superseding federal law, which is a legal impossibility, or he's saying if you cannot have this type of freedom to make this type of legislation, popular sovereignty is a farce. So he would be completely undercutting and undermining popular sovereignty, or a person's right to choose whether their territory is a free state or a slave state. So you see here that Lincoln, in a very crafty way, has trapped Douglas. And also, to sort of wrap up our discussion here, Lincoln has trapped Douglas to realize not only that popular sovereignty doesn't work, but he's also forcing Douglas to contend with the reality that the expansion of slavery is the key issue that's dividing Republicans and Democrats and America at large in the ultimate context. But Lincoln also uses this opportunity, heuristics, and he especially, to demonstrate that slavery is a moral wrong, and the Republican Party is bringing together those two elements. Slavery is a moral wrong, and slavery will not expand into the territories, as really their two central political planks that we see later in the election of 1860. Lincoln also recognizes Douglas using the fallacy of logic, the straw man argument, specifically that Lincoln believed in full racial and political equality, as well as his belief to destroy slavery even in the states it already existed in. By Lincoln calling Douglas out using this fallacy of logic, he is getting the audience to focus on his argument, stopping slavery's expansion and recognizing slavery as a moral wrong. And he's very effective in these 2 points. And after all, we know he's effective because eventually he becomes president on that platform. However, Lincoln ultimately loses the Senate seat despite getting more popular votes than Douglas. At this time, state legislatures elected their senators in a fashion similar to the Electoral College today. It wasn't a popular vote until the 17th Amendment is ratified. However, even though this is a short-term loss for Lincoln, not getting the Senate seat, it does catapult him to the top of the Republican Party, or at least get him on the short list, especially in the western United States. Ultimately, he needed the Cooper Union Address in New York City to win over the Easterners. But this, his Lincoln-Douglas debates, and especially his performance at Alton, really gained him some big popularity points. And also, the Alton debate, specifically Lincoln's use of heuristics, is Lincoln is forcing Douglas and the Democratic Party to rectify and wrestle with the contradiction of popular sovereignty. And as they wrestle over popular sovereignty, we see the Democratic Party split up. Because you cannot simultaneously allow citizens to vote against slavery, and yet slavery is legally protected and slaves can be brought into the new territories. In fact, this leads to a break between President James Buchanan and Stephen Douglas, because due to popular sovereignty, the Kansas-Nebraska Territory, specifically Kansas, passed the Lecompton Constitution, which it was a popular vote and recognized the slave interests, particularly of Kansas. And Stephen Douglas said, no, we can't recognize these results because of all the voter fraud and corruption. So already there you see the seeds of discontent and a potential split in the Democratic Party, which is actualized in 1860. We have Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And this type of realization was noticed by newspapers at the time. So here we see in the Chicago Press and Tribune, they noted Lincoln's success. The newspaper quipped, "Mr. Douglas's prudence in limiting this national discussion to 7 meetings has prevented our candidate from driving him any further into the ditch. The defeat which Mr. Douglas has sustained on the stump will be equaled only by the overthrow which awaits him at the polls." Now, ultimately, we know that Lincoln lost the Senate seat. However, he did win the presidential election. And Lincoln, the Chicago Press and Tribune, recognizes that Lincoln really did a number on Douglas and really defeated his points, most notably with the use of heuristics. Now, Lincoln, in his own sort of private political life, he asked or requested Charles Ray to create a scrapbook of Lincoln's statements of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln clearly had designs, future designs, to use his debate statements on the public stage. And even though his friend Charles Ray was kind of feeling depressed about how the debate turned out, Lincoln said, "You will soon feel better. Another blow-up is coming." Lincoln, I believe, is clearly referencing the presidential election of 1860. Lincoln also wrote a letter to Henry Asbury saying, "Douglas had the ingenuity to be supported in the late contest, both as the best means to break down and uphold the slave interest. No ingenuity can keep those antagonistic elements in harmony for long." So Lincoln realizes that by forcing Douglas to walk through the types of questions and heuristical situations that Lincoln arranged, he's going to weaken himself and weaken the party. And sure enough, history bears that out. And then we see Horace White, a Republican party figure and also a political reporter, celebrates Lincoln's success for really damaging the Democratic Party and really and elevating the Republican Party. He reflected, "Your popularity and your popular majority in the state will give us the privilege of naming our man on the national ticket in 1860, either president or vice president." So right there you have a promise from Horace White, a prominent Republican, saying, "Look, Lincoln, you've done really well, and we are going to recognize your effort in a big way on the national ticket for president." So here we see another example of Lincoln using logical techniques or rhetorical techniques to defeat his opposition and drive home his argument. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.